Hi, everybody. Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about three different books from three different genres. All were published in the 20th century. Maybe you could consider them modern classics, but if that offends you, because one of the books was published in 1974, then let's just say they are standout books in their respective genres. But the first book I'm going to talk about is the one that was published in 1974, and that is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was my first Le Guin book, and I did read her essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie last year, which is about fantasy prose. This is sci-fi. It's part of her Hainish cycle, though it could be considered a standalone. And if you don't know, I've taken an interest in sci-fi lately. I did do a video about 5 sci-fi books I'm curious about. This was on the list. But honestly, I was expecting this book not to be a very emotional read. I was expecting it to be very intellectual and interesting. And wow, I was emotional reading this book. So, this particular book deals with two contrasting societies. There's a mother planet with poverty, warring nations, no shortage of greed. I think it's very much a capitalist society, perhaps analogous to our own world. And then there's a moon planet, which has long been separated from the mother planet. That's a dystopian, utopian society. I think at one point it's referred to as a non-authoritarian communist society. But there's a physicist who lives there on the moon planet named Shevik, and he wants to bridge these two societies together, and he has this scientific knowledge that could be potentially life changing for mankind and potentially disastrous. We also have a dual timeline at play. We have chapters that take place in the present timeline when Shevik arrives on the mother planet. And then we have alternate chapters that take place in Shevik's past on the moon planet. And this dual timeline structure not only showcases Shevik's journey throughout the book, his character development, but it also shows you the contrast between the two worlds and the two societies and the ways people are socialized and the different environments on the different planets. So Shevik as a character starts out as very naive and idealistic, I would personally say. He does give a speech at the beginning of the book when he's young that to me sounded kind of like Buddhism. He talked about finding truth through suffering. But the thing to keep in mind is that his idealism and his mission seems to me very much motivated from his values as someone who comes from this society he is brought up in. And yet, his mission, which is born of those values, might be in conflict with his society. I find Shevik's character and the questions that he faces truly fascinating, especially again because they are informed by those societal views. Le Guin does not make this simple. I believe the subtitle of this book is An Ambiguous Utopia. So it's not as though the mother planet is bad and the utopian planet is good. I don't think that Le Guin makes it that simple. I think there's ambiguity there on both sides. There are definitely problems on both planets, but it still doesn't have any clear cut answers. There's just a lot that's presented and a lot that's thought through about how these two different societies function. So, some of the challenges and themes that are presented through Shevik's perspective include freedom and ownership and privacy, and whether you can own ideas or whether they should be private. Those things all go together in this story. And I just thought that the interplay of those ideas was fascinating throughout the book. It was just a constant flow of those ideas of great character development and world building. And I have to talk about the prose in this book because prose as in prose, because the beginning of the book starts out with a very direct writing style. There was a wall. It did not look important. It was built of uncut rocks, roughly motored. An adult could look right over it, and even a child could climb it. Where it crossed the roadway, instead of having a gate, it degenerated into mere geometry, a line, an idea of boundary. That starts out, as I said, very direct, almost terse, but if you're not looking for it, you might miss that her style changes as you go on in the story. There are moments where her writing becomes much more fluid, almost poetic at times. And I think that that's what kept me personally captivated as I went on and emotionally invested as well. I think that the tone of the story always reflects what Shevik is experiencing emotionally. And yet, the writing is very accessible as well. Despite there being a grand interplay of ideas, it still flows. It's still easy to read. It's very cohesive. And I highly recommend this if you enjoy societal themes and challenging questions as well. The next book I read was a reread for me, and that is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. So I read this book as a teen after seeing the movie, really enjoyed it at the time. It was never an all time favorite, but I really loved it. And rereading this as an adult was quite the experience. I reread it via audio, and I think I loved it more on reread. And I'll explain why in a bit. But just to give you the overview of what this is about a unicorn who is in a forest who finds out through overhearing a couple of hunters speak that she is the last of her kind. And this really upsets her. She wants to find out more. So she comes across this weird butterfly who speaks in riddles and reveals that all the unicorns have been pushed to the edge of the world by this big red bull. So she bravely goes on this quest to find her kind. She doesn't want to be the last of her kind. And along the way, she ends up gathering the company of um, an incompetent, beardless wizard. I say incompetent, his magic is haphazard. It works sometimes, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And this woman named Molly, who is an older woman and is sad about the fact that she finally sees a unicorn all this time later when she's no longer a maiden, when she's no longer young. So it's a woman who feels like she's lost her youth, a magician who is somewhat incompetent, who journey with this unicorn to find the last of her kind. Now, the beginning of the book starts out slightly episodic as she's gathering her companions and learning about what happened to the unicorns, and then the story is pretty straightforward. Here's the thing. This particular book is not it's not super high stakes. It's not a book that will get super high shock gasp reactions out of the reader. That's not the kind of story this is. I would say this is more of a quiet story and a poignant, bittersweet story as well. Now, when I was a teenager and I read this book, I think I was more taken with the whimsy and the wonder and just enjoyed the straightforward plot beats of the story. But as an adult, I was taken with the themes, I think, in a deeper way. So the that the characters grapple with, including loss and grief and mortality, identity, those things are brought forth not in a heavy-handed way, but they are there in the story, and I think handled in a bittersweet way because those are kind of sad themes, but they're always presented with some lightness, with some hopefulness. Hope is definitely central, I think, in the story. But there are also a lot of interesting passages. Beagle's writing is beautiful. It's stunning. It's gorgeous. It has the perfect amount of whimsy for this kind of unicorn tale. But at the same time, it has some passages that feel slightly complex, like for a young reader, anyhow. For example, there's a line: Who has choices need not choose. We must who have none. We can love but what we lose. What is gone is gone. There's a light sprinkle of metafictional humor throughout the story, as the characters are very much aware of fairy tales and they're very much aware of their role in this specific fairy tale. And yet at the same time, I would say that the ending is somewhat subversive of that. It was touching for me. It was emotional for me, but again, not in a heavy way. It's not going to again be super high stakes. Don't expect a lot from the plot, but expect a lot of the beautiful writing and the beauty of this story and what it can tell us about loss and regret and aging. I'll go ahead and mention that I picked up The Last Unicorn mostly based on nostalgia. It's a book I always meant to reread. I've been meaning to reread it for many years, and I finally got the incentive to do so when I saw Murphy add it to her TBR recently, and Jack in the Book Stack add it on a book haul, I believe. And so I thought I'd pick it up via audio, and I'm so glad I did. The next book I have to talk about is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, published in 1952. And I did mean to get to this last year. It was one of the standalones I meant to get to, and I never did. I do enjoy nautical stories. I had heard wonderful things about Hemingway's prose, and it's a short book. This particular book deals with a Cuban fisherman, and he goes on this treacherous expedition out on the Gulf Stream to capture this enormous marlin. And when we start out in the story, this old fisherman is very poor. He lives in a shack that's made out of guana leaves, which are a type of royal palm. He sleeps on newspapers. He rolls up his trousers every night for a pillow. He doesn't have much to eat. And he has one lone companion, one friend, which is a young man called the boy, who comes over, and the boy and the old man instill faith and hope and joy in one another, this optimism, which is very much needed for this expedition that this old man goes on, which is quite arduous. In some ways, this particular fisherman reminded me of Susanna Clark's Piranesi, if you've ever read that book, just in the way that he reveres everything around him. Things that could be potential obstacles, he has this total appreciation and respect for, including the sea itself. He describes the sea as la mar, which is the feminine Spanish way of describing the sea rather than el mar. And even the fish itself that he pursues, he sees that fish as an equal. He prays for the fish, even at one point says he wants to be the fish. He just has so much respect for this fish. And I found those particular qualities important for this story because as this is a survival journey and very physically taxing on this old man, at the same time, it's very much an internal journey of resilience and yeah, I think strength of character as well, having hope and faith in difficult circumstances. I had a fantastic discussion with the fantasy thinker, which I'll link in the description. I highly recommend checking it out. He had fantastic insights. And in the comment section of that video, Philip Chase, that is, commented that he thought of this story as existentialist. And when he mentioned that, it kind of reframed what I how I thought of this story because there are obstacles, as I mentioned, forces of nature that seem to be in conflict with this fisherman's mission. And yet, these forces of nature, I mean, they could just be seen as very impersonal, at least the way that Hemingway is writing them. It depends on how you interpret what Hemingway was doing, I think. I just find that interesting to speculate about because I think when I was reading the book, I was kind of caught up in the religious references, the Hail Marys and Our Fathers that are mentioned in the story. He says the Hail Mary at one point in the story, and so I thought that maybe that was the direction that Hemingway was going with this, is speaking more to the journey of faith. And Hemingway is noted for having very simple prose or very clear prose that invites readers to seek out depth in his storytelling. So I thought that it was fun to do that, honestly, after reading the book. But I'll be honest, I was not emotionally engaged at all when I was reading this book. I do appreciate what Hemingway was doing with all the things I mentioned, and I'm sure there's more there that I didn't see, but I just wasn't really all that emotionally engaged. What can I say? I was kind of bored. Sorry to say that, a little embarrassed to say that, but I could still see why people love this book and why it's a favorite for so many people. And I'm still glad I read it and got to have that wonderful discussion. So that concludes the three books I have to talk about in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know in the comment section down below if you've read any of these books, if you're planning to read any of these books, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.